Hello, the following video is intended to help you differentiate between read sensor and wait for, as well as the various types of loops that you may want to use as part of your program. First, let's look at the difference between the read sensor function and the wait for function. I've closed my functions palette, and so I need to reopen it, so I just simply go up to View, Functions Palette, and we'll see that our functions palette returns. And at the bottom we have our NXT robotics. And what I have here on the left side of my block diagram already is a read sensor and a wait for, which can simply be obtained by going to the NXT inputs and outputs. You see our read sensor and our wait for. And you can see up in the top right hand corner I have my context help open up so we can differentiate between the two of them. How would we want to use the two of these as part of a program? Well, first let's look at the read sensor function, which is this one right here. We can see that it has a drop-down menu, and we can choose the sensor that we want to use. Let's just go with the default of a touch sensor being pressed. And we can see from our context help that what this is doing is reading the touch sensor connected to whatever the port is. The default is port 1, and how many times it's being pressed. Okay? And so if I was to use this as part of the program I have here to the right, and if I was to add this after my motors turn on, what would happen is that if I were to wire these all across, my ports A and C motors would start to go forward. The next function would automatically go to the next function and say, go ahead and start reading how many times the touch sensor is being pressed. But then it wouldn't stay here. It would immediately go and break and then wait for 1 second, and my program would be over. Now, if I was to, instead of using a read sensor function, use a wait for function, and oftentimes this can be a little confusing because the default is time, but if I do click on my drop-down menu for my wait for function, you can see that I can wait for the various sensors or even buttons on the NXT. And so if I select wait for touch, and again let's use pressed, you see that this function and this function look similar, but they are different in nature, and it is sort of identified by this little hourglass. And so if I am to wire this up now, what would happen is that my motors A and C would start to go forward, and then the program would stop here and just wait. And these motors are still running, but it is waiting for that touch sensor to be pressed before it does anything else. As soon as that touch sensor is pressed, that's when A and C will break. It'll wait 1 second and my program will be over. Okay? So there's a big difference between these two functions and how you may use them. And I'll show you an example of how you may want to use the read sensor as we go into our loops discussion. So speaking of loops, how do we find our loops? You want to go back to NXT Robotics, NXT Programming, and our Structures option. And you'll see you have various different types of loops here. The first one I want to discuss is the while loop. If I click on while loop, it will allow me to draw my loop around my program. And so what I've done here is I've got my program that is motors A and C going forward, waiting for the touch sensor to be pressed, then it's going to break and it will wait for 1 second, and with this loop that I've now added to my program, it'll loop back to the beginning, and after 1 second it'll start to run motors A and C again, waiting for the touch sensor. And if I want that to occur forever, I just simply left click, create a constant, and make that constant false. All right, meaning that it will never leave that while loop. Okay. Now, it may be that you only want this to occur for a certain amount of cycles. If that's the case, instead of a while loop, all right, and make sure that you drag your program out. If you just simply delete this while loop, the whole program will be deleted. All right. If we want this to happen for a certain number of cycles, what I simply want to use is a for loop. So again, I click and I draw my loop around. And this time, all I want to do is come up to the N up in the top left-hand corner, create a constant, and this will allow me to establish how many times it's going to loop. Let's say I want it to go for 5 times. So now, similar to the while loop that we used before, it'll run this program and loop back, but it'll only do it 5 times. And after those 5 times, I can then write a program that attaches to this loop after those 5 iterations occur. Okay? Now, what happens if we want our program to have options? Meaning that we want it to do one thing if, say, the touch sensor is pressed and we want it to do something else if the touch sensor is not pressed. How do we create that program? Well, that's where we want our case structures. Okay, so I've clicked on case structures, and I'm just going to draw my case structure. And we can see that we can have a true and a false option. All right, but what determines what's true and false? And here's an example where you can use your read sensor. So I'm going to drag my touch sensor, read sensor pressed up here. And what you can see is that up in the bottom right-hand corner, we have a yes, no. And so if I just simply drag this to my case loop here, we can see that this case structure is now determined by whether or not the touch sensor is pressed or not pressed. And so in one case, if it's pressed, that would be my true. In my other case, that would be my false. And I can actually write two separate programs. For example, let's say I delete this line and I say, hey, when the touch sensor is pressed, I want A and C to drive forward. Oops. Let's grab the whole function here. Okay, so I want A and C to go forward. But when it's not pressed, I want it to break. So I simply click on false. Let's get our braked function here. And actually, let's have it break for 1 second. So I'm going to grab this whole function here. Oops. I drag that in here to my false situation. So now when I click my false and my true, I can see that I have two separate functions that are occurring. And those are being controlled by my touch sensor. And let's say I want this to go forever, I can then draw a while loop around this entire structure. Okay, again, adding our false constant to make sure that this occurs forever. And so now, similarly, I'm controlling my touch sensor I'm controlling my movement of my car by my touch sensor, but now I'm using the read touch sensor. Again, this is determining whether or not it's true or false, true being if it's pressed, and it will run forward. False, if it's not being pressed, it will break for 1 second. Okay? So this is just a very quick introduction to 3 different types of loops that you may want to use as part of your program in controlling your robot within the maze.